The story begins on a freezing Ontario morning. A heavy snowstorm covers the small town of Pontypool. The roads are nearly empty, visibility is poor, and the world feels hostile and isolated. Grant Mazzy, a former big city radio host now reduced to working in a small town station, drives to work through the storm. He is tired, bitter, and clinging to his old sense of importance. On the road, he sees something shocking. A disoriented woman suddenly appears in front of his car, stumbling through the snow. She seems dazed, muttering to herself, but the words are drowned by the storm. Grant brakes hard, swerves, and nearly crashes. When he looks again, the woman is gone. Confused and shaken, he continues driving. This strange encounter sets the tone for the day. Grant reaches the town's small radio station, CLSY, which operates out of the basement of a church. The setting is cramped and old, with stone walls, narrow hallways, and outdated equipment. It feels more like a bunker than a workplace. Inside, he meets Sydney Briar, the station manager, who is strict and professional. She values structure and clear reporting, the opposite of Grant's dramatic personality. The third person in the studio is Laurel-Ann Drummond, a young assistant who previously served in the military. She admires Grant and looks up to him, unlike Sydney, who keeps him grounded. Together, the three form an odd team: the bitter ex-star, the no-nonsense manager, and the enthusiastic assistant. The day's show starts normally. Grant settles into the booth, coffee in hand, ready to perform. He speaks as if he's addressing a nationwide audience, even though he's only broadcasting to a small town. He comments on the weather, the storm, and even mentions the strange woman he thought he saw on the road. To him, everything is material for drama. At first, it feels like an ordinary local broadcast. The station hums with routine, Sydney manages the flow, and Laurel-Ann handles the technical side. But soon, small signs of unease begin to creep in. Calls from outside suggest the day might not stay normal for long. A local man named Ken Loney, who reports traffic from his car, calls into the station. At first, his reports sound routine. He mentions road closures, cars stuck in the snow, and minor accidents. But then, his voice becomes tense. He says a crowd has gathered outside the home of a local doctor. The people are shouting nonsense, repeating words over and over. It sounds less like a protest and more like a chant. Ken doesn't understand what he's seeing. He describes people standing close together, mumbling and repeating the same words again and again. The image he paints is unsettling. A crowd frozen in the cold, behaving like broken records. Grant, always dramatic, treats Ken's report as good radio material. He asks questions, trying to push Ken to describe it in vivid detail. Sydney, however, is cautious. She tells Grant not to exaggerate or create panic. Laurel-Ann listens quietly, visibly unsettled. Soon after, Ken calls again, this time panicked. The crowd outside the doctor's office has grown larger. Some people are starting to attack others, biting and clawing like animals. Ken describes it in real time, his voice shaking, his words chaotic. In the studio, tension rises. What was once a strange news story is now turning into something dangerous. Suddenly, the station's broadcast is hijacked. A stern government voice cuts in, ordering all listeners to avoid certain words and phrases. The broadcast warns that some kind of virus is spreading through language itself. Words, especially terms of endearment or familiar phrases, are becoming infected. The warning is confusing and terrifying. Sydney insists they play it safe and stick to professional announcements. Grant, skeptical, mocks the message on air, calling it absurd. But Laurel-Ann looks pale. The idea that words themselves can spread infection unsettles her deeply. The three of them, trapped inside their little studio, start to realize that whatever is happening outside is unlike anything they've ever known. The storm outside grows worse, and the phone lines keep ringing. Ken calls again, and this time his voice is trembling. He says the people outside the doctor's office are no longer human in behavior. They're repeating words until they lose all meaning, then lashing out in bursts of violence. He describes a man smashing his head against a wall while repeating a single word over and over. Inside the station, Hrant tries to keep things calm for listeners, but his dramatic tone makes it feel like a horror broadcast. Sydney demands that he stop exaggerating, but even she can't ignore how serious things sound. Laurel-Ann listens closely, her face tight with fear. Then it happens inside the studio itself. Laurel-Ann, the young assistant, begins to repeat a word unconsciously. At first, it seems like a slip of the tongue, but then she can't stop. The word tumbles out of her mouth again and again, faster and faster. Hrant and Sydney realize in shock that Laurel-Ann has been infected by the language virus. She clutches the equipment table, eyes wild, whispering the word until her voice cracks. She tries to speak normally, but every sentence circles back to the same sound, the same word, like her brain is broken on a single track. Hrant rushes to her side, shouting her name, but that only feeds the infection. Sydney, terrified but focused, yells at Hrant to stop speaking. Words themselves are the danger. Silence is the only safety. Laurel-Ann collapses to the ground, trembling, her body shaking as though her mind is being torn apart by the repetition. The two remaining staff members watch helplessly as their friend slips into madness. The nightmare escalates further when voices are heard outside the church. The infected townspeople have arrived at the radio station. They pound on the walls and doors, chanting broken words. Their voices echo through the halls, an eerie, endless drone of repetition. Hrant looks out a narrow window and sees them pressed against the glass, their mouths moving, their faces blank. They are not attacking in anger. They are simply pulled toward language, toward sound, toward the broadcast itself. The infected are drawn to words like moths to a flame. Sydney locks the doors, knowing the three of them are now trapped. The outside world is gone. The studio is a fortress, but also a prison. Inside, Laurel-Ann continues her downward spiral, whispering nonsense syllables into the microphone until Sydney cuts the audio feed. Hrant finally begins to realize the horror of it all. He had always believed words were power, his voice his weapon. Now words have become poison. In the middle of the chaos, a man suddenly bursts into the studio. He is Dr. Mendez, the very doctor whose office Ken had described earlier. He has managed to escape the mob and stumbled into the station for safety. Mendez is frantic, but intelligent. He immediately notices Laurel-Ann's condition and recognizes it as part of the spreading illness. He explains that the virus is not biological in the normal sense. It spreads through language itself, through hearing and understanding certain words. Once someone becomes stuck on a word, their mind begins to unravel. They repeat the word endlessly until their body gives out. Hrant and Sydney struggle to grasp the concept. Words are supposed to connect people, not destroy them. But Mendez insists, language is the vector. While they talk, Laurel-Ann's condition worsens. She no longer looks like herself. Her face is pale, her voice a hoarse echo of the same meaningless syllables. She repeats words with childlike rhythm, locked in a loop. The three others watch in horror as she bangs her head against the sound booth glass. Over and over, the dull thud fills the studio. Her blood smears the glass, her body weakening with each strike. Sydney screams for Hrant to stop watching, but they can't look away. Finally, Laurel-Ann collapses in a heap, her body twitching once, then falling still. The infection has consumed her completely. For Sydney and Hrant, the loss is devastating. Laurel-Ann had been loyal young and full of life. Now she is gone, destroyed not by violence or disease in the usual sense, but by words themselves. Dr. Mendez forces them to think carefully. He explains that not all words are dangerous. The infection spreads through terms of endearment, nicknames, or familiar language, words that carry emotional weight. It seems to prey on the meaning behind the word as much as the sound. Sydney writes down a list of words to avoid, but quickly realizes the futility. Any word could become infected at any time. The more it is repeated, the more dangerous it becomes. Hrant begins to panic. He has spent his entire life using words, shaping language, and entertaining through speech. Now, his very talent has become a liability. He wonders aloud if simply being on the radio is helping spread the infection. Mendez doesn't answer. His eyes are dark and tired. He simply says, "The virus is learning." The pounding on the walls intensifies. The infected townspeople are no longer just mumbling. They are screaming broken words. The sound of repetition fills the air like a chant. Hrant, Sydney, and Dr. Mendez press themselves against the equipment, knowing the flimsy doors won't hold forever. The sound itself becomes suffocating. Every phrase outside is fractured and looped like broken radio static. Blood echoes in dozens of voices, then switches to kill, kill, kill. The rhythm is hypnotic, terrifying, and relentless. Inside the station, the three survivors can barely speak without fear of spreading infection further. The silence is crushing, yet safer than words. Tension between Hrant and Sydney rises. Hrant wants to keep broadcasting, convinced that their only weapon is information. He argues that if they stop speaking, they're already dead. Sydney counters that words are exactly what's killing everyone. The broadcast could spread the virus to the entire town, maybe even further. Their fight is heated but whispered, both of them terrified of triggering infection. Mendez watches with uneasy detachment, as though studying them like specimens. He mutters that the virus is evolving, learning to use words against humanity. He warns them that language itself may collapse under the weight of the infection. Sydney snaps at him, demanding solutions instead of theories. Mendez admits he has none. All he can do is observe and hope something emerges. It is Hrant, of all people, who stumbles onto the breakthrough. Watching Sydney's fearful eyes, he suddenly begins to twist his words. He takes a dangerous phrase she nearly repeats and redefines it on the spot. Instead of saying kill, he reframes it as kiss. Instead of meaning violence, he makes the word absurd, even gentle. Sydney stares at him in confusion. Her mind struggles, then resets. For a moment, it works. The infected word loses its power. Hrant realizes that the virus is tied not just to words, but to meaning. If you break the meaning, scramble it, or force a new definition, you can disrupt the infection. It's not a cure, but it's a weapon, a way to fight back with language itself. For the first time, hope flickers inside the dark station. Dr. Mendez watches closely, fascinated. He murmurs that Hrant is not fighting the virus with medicine or force, but with creativity. By changing what words mean, he is robbing the virus of its fuel. Hrant, once just a bitter radio man, suddenly realizes that his skill with words is the only weapon they have. Their fragile victory is short-lived. The pounding outside grows violent, glass shatters, and the first infected force their way into the church basement. The sound is unbearable. Dozens of voices repeating broken words, echoing off the stone walls. Sydney and Hrant barricade the studio door, while Mendez shouts in panic. The infected slam against the barriers, their mouths drooling words instead of saliva. They claw at the doors, desperate not to attack for food, but to reach the voices inside. the broadcast, the words, the meaning. Sydney wants to flee through the back, but Hrant insists they stay in the booth. The radio is their only weapon. He believes they can turn the airwaves into a cure, or at least a shield. As the infected press harder, the studio shakes. Laurel-Ann's body lies crumpled nearby, a silent reminder of what happens if they fail. Hrant flips on the microphone. His voice, calm but powerful, fills the airwaves. He begins to play with language, redefining words live on radio. He tells the listeners that kill means kiss, that kill means cure, that kill means keep alive. He reshapes every dangerous phrase into nonsense, then into something gentle, then into something meaningless. His tone is hypnotic, commanding, and oddly soothing. Sydney sits beside him, whispering corrections, feeding him words to twist. Together they build a rhythm, a strange poetry designed to confuse the virus. Outside, the mob hesitates. Their chants falter. The repetition breaks down. For a brief moment, it seems the infected are disoriented, even weakened by the broadcast. But the doors are still shaking. The barricades won't last. Inside the booth, the three survivors know they are out of time. The barricades finally give way. The infected pour into the church basement, their voices like an endless chant of broken meaning. The sound vibrates through the walls, rattling the glass. Sydney clutches her headphones, trembling, while Hrant leans closer to the microphone. He knows this is their last chance. Dr. Mendez panics. He runs to the back of the booth, muttering to himself, speaking in riddles, then vanishes into the crowd of infected. His voice becomes part of the chorus, lost in the storm of words. Hrant and Sydney are alone now. Hrant seizes the mic. His voice is calm, almost hypnotic as he speaks directly to the infected outside. He pours his entire soul into reshaping language. "You are not lost," he says. "You are home." The word is not death. The word is life. The word is love. Sydney, shaking but determined, sits beside him. Together they repeat the twisted definitions, playing with meanings until the words collapse into nonsense and rebuild into something new. Their broadcast becomes like a strange prayer, both desperate and hopeful. Outside, the mob hesitates. The rhythm of repetition falters. Some of the infected even fall silent, their minds caught in the confusion. The method seems to be working, but the cost is enormous. The camera closes in on Hrant and Sydney inside the booth. The world outside grows quieter, but not safe. The storm still howls, the infected still press against the walls, but the words are shifting. Hrant leans close to Sydney, their voices soft, intimate. He tells her he loves her, but even that confession twists into strange new meanings. They redefine love until it no longer sounds like itself. The two of them continue speaking, locked in a trance, as though they might survive if they never stop talking. The screen fades to black. Their fate is left uncertain. Did they find a cure, or are they simply drowning in words? The story ends in silence, leaving the answer behind for the audience to wrestle with.